Thank you, Leila, for the very kind introduction. Thank you all for coming. I've given a lot of talks. This might be the most beautiful venue I've ever spoken at, or one of them. And it's really an honor to see this fantastic turnout, which I really take as a sign of the Yale community's significant interest in the issues that we're going to discuss today. Given this great turnout, I think what I'd like to do, and my thanks to all the organizations that sponsored this event on very short notice, and for all of you for spending some time early in the semester to be here for this conversation. So what I would like to do in this presentation is really to provide about 30 minutes, a little bit of background about a recent Human Rights Watch report that Leila mentioned in the introduction, the one on apartheid, to explain a little bit about how Human Rights Watch reached that determination, the way we went about doing the research, the basis for our finding, the way forward. I also, since I'm speaking at Yale, want to address the issue of academic freedom and the space to speak about Palestine on American campuses. Many of you will have been familiar with what has been happening in recent weeks at the Harvard Kennedy School regarding the appointment of Kenneth Roth, the former executive director of Human Rights Watch, my former boss. And I also want to briefly leave some time to discuss that, but I also want to have time to have a conversation. I hope you will bring questions related to this topic, related to academic freedom, or related to the larger issues of human rights in Israel-Palestine. So let me start by saying Israel-Palestine is back in the news. It's been a very difficult period in Israel-Palestine. It's been a very difficult week, month, year, decade, century, depending on how you want to do the calculation. So I want to acknowledge that and encourage you, if you have questions about the specifics on the ground, to also ask about that. But really where I want to start this presentation is in talking a little bit about Human Rights Watch and the process that led us to this report that we released in April of 2021. So many of you will probably have heard the name Human Rights Watch. Maybe you've read some of our publications. We are a global human rights organization. We document human rights abuses. We advocate for changes in policies to better respect human rights. We cover 100 countries around the world. And we follow the very same methodology and theory of change in all of these countries. Our approach is to investigate human rights abuse, to document our findings, to expose human rights abuse, and then to advocate for change that allows for greater protections of international human rights and humanitarian law. We cover every country in the Middle East and North Africa, among the 100 countries, and we've been working on human rights abuses in Israel-Palestine, one of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa, one of the regions in the Middle East and North Africa, for nearly 30 years. I've been in this role for about 6 years. I've had predecessors before me who've been doing this work for many, many more years. So in the course of 3 decades of documenting and exposing human rights abuse in Israel-Palestine, Human Rights Watch has covered virtually every topic under the sun, right? Whether we're talking about the escalations in the Gaza Strip, right? The killing of young boys and girls, parents, families during airstrikes, whether it be punitive home demolitions in the West Bank, whether it be the restrictions on access to land in Israel proper. We've been doing this for a long time. So the question is, why did Human Rights Watch just in 2021 reach this conclusion about apartheid? So let me start with that question. And the starting point really has to do with what I just said. When the occupation was getting ready to turn 50 years, the occupation began in 1967. When it was getting ready to turn 50, in about 2017, Human Rights Watch began reflecting on our work. And it's not just us. Our partners at Amnesty International and Israeli and Palestinian civil society began a similar process. And when we started looking back, we realized that we've documented virtually every human rights abuse you can imagine between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. But yet, despite that work, when you come to places like Yale University, the conversation about Israel-Palestine is so divorced from the reality on the ground of human rights abuse. You hear terms like two-state solution, like a peace process, like two warring sides. But if I were to describe, and I've lived in Israel, Palestine, I've worked on it for many years, I covered for one of the world's largest human rights organizations. If I were to describe Israel and Palestine to an 8-year-old, I would start by saying these things. 30 seconds. Here's how I would describe the reality. I would start by saying that one government primarily rules over the area between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. That's the Israeli government. In this area, two groups of roughly equal size, Jewish Israelis and Palestinians, live. And that government's policy has methodically been to privilege members of one group, Jewish Israelis, and systematically repress members of the other group, Palestinians, at different degrees of intensity. Now that 30 seconds probably flies in the face of so much of what you've heard about Israel and Palestine. So our realization at Human Rights Watch was, maybe we need to ask a different research question. Many of you, most of you are students at Yale, and you know about the process of research. So what we realized when the occupation turned 50 is, why don't we ask a different question? Instead of trying to understand what are restrictions on access to land in this area of Israel, or what are the policies around freedom of movement in this part of the occupied Palestinian territory, let's ask a simple question. How does Israel treat Palestinians? So we embarked on a 2-year research project trying to answer that question. So we took a methodology that was multifaceted. First thing we did is we did case studies. So we went to different parts of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Israel, Gaza, and we compared the treatment of Palestinian communities living side by side with Jewish Israeli communities. And we did these deep dive analysis in different areas. Then we supplemented those case studies by comparing and looking at the trends in 30 plus years of Human Rights Watch research. We compiled our statistics, we looked at the trends, we analyzed the data, and then we went beyond our own data. We then started looking at the research done by Amnesty International, by Israeli human rights groups, by Palestinian human rights groups. So then we had compiled this large set of information. We looked at other sources. We looked at Israeli government statements, policy planning documents, justifications, legal sources. We did a lot of interviews. And then we compiled, based on this, a 200+ page report documenting how Israel treats Palestinians along several main metrics, right? Largely about access to land, resources, and legal status and civil rights. Then we applied the law. So I know I spoke, some of you may have heard, I spoke at the law school in the fall. And in the law school, I focused a lot more on the law. I know we have a lot more non-law students here and general students. So let me take a few minutes to explain what I mean about the law that applies in this kind of situation. Because again, Human Rights Watch, our mandate is international human rights and humanitarian law. So we document facts, that's step 1, which I just described to you in this report. And step 2 is we apply the law. In international law, there is a prohibition on severe discriminatory oppression. It is unlawful. And there's a term for it under international law. That term is apartheid. So while the term was coined in relation to specific historical events, a very specific context in southern Africa, international treaties, including the International Covenant on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, define apartheid as a universal legal term. So when you want to say, is there severe discriminatory oppression, the word you use legally is apartheid. Apartheid is also a crime under international law. There is a convention from the 1970s on the crime of apartheid. There is also the 1998 Rome Statute to the International Criminal Court. This is the document that identifies the mandate of the largest, most important international criminal body in the world. Apartheid is listed as one of 11 crimes against humanity. So what does apartheid mean legally? Like any crime, it has 3 basic components. You need a certain kind of act, right? That takes place with a certain intent or mental state. And you need that to take place in a certain context, right? Like any crime. You know, what's the act, what's the intent, what's the context? In the case of apartheid, the act are things known as inhumane acts, okay? Inhumane acts include things like forcible displacement, mass land confiscation, things like that. So those inhumane acts must take place in a context in which there is systematic oppression by one group of people over another, right? So really serious abuses, inhumane acts that take place in a context of systematic oppression. And the third element is that those acts must be carried out with the intent to maintain the systematic oppression. So let me simplify. Inhumane acts, systematic oppression, intent to dominate. Those are the three things you need to find apartheid. Let me note parenthetically that there is a related crime against humanity known as persecution. I won't focus on it significantly today, but just so you know, persecution is defined also, it's customary international law, it's prohibited, as severe abuses of fundamental rights when combined with a discriminatory intent. So there's a large amount of overlap between the two definitions. So I just mentioned the process of how we did the research, and I mentioned the law. When Human Rights Watch applied those facts to the law that I documented, we reached the conclusion that Israeli authorities are committing the crimes against humanity of apartheid and persecution against Palestinians. So I want to devote the bulk of my time to describing how we reached that conclusion. And again, it's a 200-page report, so I'm just going to give you the highlights. I'm very happy in the discussion to go into greater depth. So let's take those three elements I mentioned and apply them to what we found in our research. Starting with the intent to dominate, right? So you need an intent to dominate. Human Rights Watch concluded that Israeli authorities do maintain an intent to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. This largely manifests itself through the desire to control land and demographics for the benefit of Jewish Israelis and to the detriment of Palestinians. Let me give you an example first of the demographics. Israel, since 2003, has had a law that prohibits the granting of long-term legal status to Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza married to Israeli citizens or nationals. Let me simplify that for you. Israelis can marry people of virtually every nationality in the world and grant them the legal status to live with them in Israel, but not Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza. Now, Israel justifies this policy in the name of security, but our report includes loads of evidence of why this policy was justified by the desire to maintain a demographic supermajority of Jewish Israelis vis-a-vis Palestinians. It's a discriminatory policy. There are many, many other examples the report highlights. Now, the second part of the intent to dominate that we document is maximizing the land for Jewish Israelis and confining Palestinians into smaller and smaller enclaves. Now, this is an explicit policy. Within Israel proper, for example, it takes different forms, but it's explicit. Within Israel proper, and again, for those that are really new to Israel and Palestine, when I say Israel proper, we're talking about 78% of the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. The other 22% is the occupied Palestinian territory, which is the West Bank and Gaza. So within Israel, the government has a formal policy to Judaize the Negev and the Galilee. The Negev and Galilee account for about 2/3 of the land in Israel. It's where most Palestinians in Israel live. So there's a formal government policy to Judaize these areas. Jerusalem, the municipality of Jerusalem, which includes occupied East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem, we reviewed in the report the government policy planning documents, which lay out in explicit terms that the objective of the municipality is to, quote, maintain a solid Jewish majority in the city. Now imagine a written policy to maintain the superiority of one group over the other. And by the way, it's not just that. The policy lists the target demographic ratios they hope to maintain, and identifies prescriptive policies to further that goal. Densification of Palestinian neighborhoods, for example. Take the West Bank. In the West Bank, we reviewed decades of Israeli government policy documents, which lay out in plain terms the government's objective to basically maximize settlements, build them between Palestinian communities. And it's written out. For example, the 1983 Drovel's plans, one of the government policy documents, calls for, quote, settle the land between the Arab minority population centers and their surroundings, end quote. Noting that doing so would make it, quote, hard for Palestinians to create territorial continuity and political unity and remove any trace of doubt about our intent to control Judea and Samaria, which is now, end quote, their term for the West Bank, forever. And it's not just words on paper. These are policies that are backed up by massive land grabs, investment and integration to connect settlements and roads and water, electricity networks between the illegal settlements. And let me note again, because I'm not speaking to a legal audience here, settlements are a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits one country from transferring their civilian population and territory occupied or acquired by war. Right? We'll get to more in the West Bank in a second, but these are war crimes. And they're basically saying we're going to prioritize the land for these illegal settlements over indigenous Palestinian communities. And then even in Gaza, right? So Gaza, Israel withdrew its civilian settler population in 2005, but continues to pursue a strategy to basically turn the Gaza Strip into a demographic receptacle to hold, it's 25 by 7 miles, okay? 2.1 million Palestinians live there. It's an open-air prison, one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. And basically, Israel had removed about 8,000 settlers in order, and we studied the policy. And we'll get more into the Gaza policy, but basically, they use Gaza as a way of sort of taking Palestinians off the demographic books, trying to concentrate them there and outside of the West Bank, which they hope to retain. Now, let me make one point clear. Israel justifies many of its policies in the name of security. However, many of the abuses at the core of apartheid, for example, the marriage ban that I talked about, the 2003 prohibition, or even the granting of building permits to Jewish Israelis systematically but not to Palestinians, or the land expropriation for settlers from Palestinians, have no security. Security is not offered as a justification. Israel doesn't even try to offer it because there is no security justification. And even where security is a consideration for Israel, for example, in the policy towards Gaza, Israel has pursued a policy that goes so far beyond what international law authorizes that security no more can justify their oppression than security could justify torture or other very serious crimes. So let me conclude this part of my presentation by saying this evidence, and I just gave you like the, examples, led us to conclude that the Israeli government has pursued an intent to maintain the domination by Jewish Israelis over Palestinians. So that's 1/3 of our puzzle, right? So let's move to part 2 of the puzzle. So that intent exists. Now, does systematic oppression of Palestinians exist? Second part. We concluded, yes, that the Israeli government has methodically established a 2-tiered system that privileges Jewish Israelis to the detriment of Palestinians. That looks different in different areas. So let me go through each area in brief. So let's go to the West Bank. We talked about the West Bank a second ago. The West Bank, you have about 2.5 million Palestinians living amid 700,000 Jewish Israelis living in the illegal settlements I mentioned earlier. Now, in this area, you have people who live across the street, literally across the street. I've been there, I've seen it. But there are 2 different legal systems, one for Jewish Israelis, one for Palestinians. So if a Jewish Israeli and a Palestinian commit the exact same crime in the exact same place, they are tried in different courts, where different laws apply to them, where they receive different due process rights. Or if I'm being more specific, one has due process, one doesn't. And where they receive different sentences for the very same act. Not only that, but in the West Bank, Israel enforces segregation. So Palestinians cannot enter settlements which, footnote, were built on land expropriated from Palestinians. even land that Palestinians own. They cannot enter those settlements except if they are entering as a laborer bearing a special permit. In addition, Israel not only has expropriated the land and resources, but it provides it on a discriminatory basis for the settlers and to the detriment of Palestinians. So, separate and unequal allocation, segregation, dual bodies of law. Let's move to East Jerusalem. Now, East Jerusalem is a part of the West Bank. Israel occupied it in 1967, continues to occupy it, but Israel annexed it. So East Jerusalem, Israel considers part of its territory. But many of these same dynamics persist in East Jerusalem. Let me give you one example. If two students come to Yale from Jerusalem, one is Jewish-Israeli, one is Palestinian, they live in the same city, they might even live across the street. The Jewish Israeli is a citizen of Israel. They could spend 4 years, they could do a PhD here, they could spend a decade, they could go back, they have the same legal status, they're a citizen. But a Palestinian Jerusalemite, right, almost assuredly is not a citizen. They're actually a stateless person that has residency, even though they are from Jerusalem. They're given the status of resident, like a foreigner in Jerusalem, and they could lose that status, their ability to live in their home city, simply by being abroad for too long. And this is not some abstract idea. About 15,000 Palestinians have lost their right to live in Jerusalem because they were abroad too long, or they moved to the wrong part of the West Bank. Okay, so that's West Bank, East Jerusalem. Let's move to Gaza, the other part of the occupied Palestinian territory. Now, I mentioned the size of Gaza and the population. Since 2007, the Israeli government has maintained a closure policy of Gaza. What that means is there's a generalized ban on movement. Nobody can exit, nobody can enter, except if you fit within a narrow band of humanitarian exemptions. So that means the vast majority of Gaza residents have never left the 25 by 7 mile open air prison. This is not some abstract thing. My colleague, who I supervise and manage, our Gaza senior research assistant, when I started this job in late 2016, she had never left Gaza in her life. She was 31 years old, well educated, and she left for the first time by some stroke of luck, another long process with the intervention of a foreign embassy. The only way she could leave in 2018. I met her for the first time. I'd worked with her for a year and a half. But even despite that, if she applied a week, like right now she's back in Gaza, if she wants to apply to leave, she will be rejected. Not because she poses a security risk. It's not a security policy. It's not about whether or not you're on a list. It's a ban on everybody unless you show a very urgent humanitarian need, like you need a life-saving surgery. Right? So 15 years that people, it's not just that they can't go to America. They can't go to Ramallah, which is part of the occupied Palestinian territory. You should be able to move between Gaza and Ramallah, which even Israel considers one territorial entity, the way you might move between New York City, and New Haven, right? If the Wi-Fi was maybe better on the Amtrak. My point is, it should be something you do, presumptively pretty easy, right? But in Gaza, you can't even go to the other part of your own territory. And it's not just a ban on the movement of people, it's also a ban on the movement of goods. So during the first 3 years of the closure, between 2007 and 2010, Israel kept a calorie count, an average caloric count of how many calories they wanted someone in Gaza to eat, and they would limit what was allowed in based on that caloric count. When that went public, the Israeli government changed that policy, but they still maintained strict restrictions. In addition, they limit exports out of Gaza, not for security reasons. I mean, what's the security threat of strawberries going to Ramallah or eggplant going into Israel? They do it to starve the economy. Today in Gaza, 80% of the population relies on humanitarian aid. The majority of people spend the majority of their day without electricity. Right? Well, electricity is provided 24/7 to Jewish Israelis that live in the occupied territory, that live just across the Gaza fences. In addition to all that, right? The majority of the population has not left all of the Gaza Strip. The GDP per capita for the people studying economics in the room has gone down since the early 1990s by about 23%. This is circa a few years ago. So that's Gaza. And the third part is within Israel proper, where Palestinians, and let's be clear, they're about 20% of the population. Inside Israel, they're citizens. So unlike the first three, they are citizens of Israel. But at the same time, they still face systemic discrimination, including on their access to land, even their legal status, right? They are citizens, yes, of Israel, but they're not nationals. In fact, Israel in 2018 passed a law with constitutional status known as the Jewish nation-state law that basically said Israel is not only a state for the Jewish people, but that certain rights, including the right to self-determination, the access to settlement, land basically, is for the Jewish people alone, and not for the 20% of the population that's not Jewish. To give you one example, Israeli law permits small towns and communities to basically exclude people from living there. And research shows that there are hundreds of small Jewish towns and villages that have no Palestinians living there, that have admissions committees that block Palestinians from living there. Palestinians, about 20% of the population, live on about 3% of the land. I could give many other data points. Put it all together, Human Rights Watch concluded that systematic oppression of Palestinians for the benefit of Jewish Israelis exists. So we now have two of the three parts of the puzzle: intent to dominate and systematic oppression. The third part of the puzzle was inhumane acts. And Human Rights Watch again concluded that the Israeli authorities have committed inhumane acts against Palestinians. Our report focused on 5 clusters of inhumane acts. Now, this is not an exclusive list. There are other lists by Amnesty International, by Palestinian Israeli groups that are different. But let me just briefly mention the inhumane acts that we've documented at Human Rights Watch. One, and I've already talked about the movement restrictions, right, from Gaza. But let me talk about the movement restrictions in the West Bank. In the West Bank, Palestinians require permits to enter large sections of the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. So today, probably everybody in this room could take the train to New York, fly to Tel Aviv, and go to East Jerusalem, go to the Old City. Not me, because the Israeli government kicked me out. Side note, probably the rest of you can, right? But a Palestinian born and raised in the West Bank cannot go to East Jerusalem. Sometimes it's like a kilometer or two away. They're not allowed without a permit. That's virtually impossible to obtain. Not only that, Israel has built, according to the UN, about, and this is circa a couple of years ago, 593, I think is the exact number, closure obstacles and other checkpoints across the West Bank that can turn a short commute from home to school, school to hospital, into an hours-long humiliating ordeal. On top of that, the Israeli government built a separation barrier, a wall in some places, that is largely built on Palestinian land, and that separates Palestinian communities from hospitals, schools, one another, access to water resources, thousands of Palestinians stuck on the wrong side of the separation barrier. So all that, the closure of Gaza, the checkpoints, the permit regime, the wall, inhumane act, number 1. Inhumane act number 2 that we documented was the mass expropriation of Palestinian land. 1/3 of the West Bank, more than 2 million dunams of land, we documented has been stolen from Palestinians and given to build illegal settlements and for land around settlements largely. 99% of the land that Israel has taken over as government land has been given, when given to civilians, 99% of that has gone to Jewish Israelis, not to Palestinians, right? So this mass expropriation of land, it reduces Palestinians to living in about 100, and exact number for you, 165 non-contiguous territorial islands, right? Because you keep taking land, so Palestinians, it's a Swiss cheese, enclave of Bantustans or enclaves that they live in the West Bank, right? So number 1, we said, right? We said movement restrictions, sweeping movement restrictions, 2, land expropriation. The third category of inhumane acts we documented are policies that, home demolitions and other policies that lead Palestinians to leave their homes. Now, Israel makes it effectively impossible for Palestinians to get building permits in the majority of the West Bank under its exclusive control and in East Jerusalem. So according to government data, Israeli government data, between 2016 and 2018, the Israeli government issued 100 times more demolition orders than building permits for Palestinians in this part called Area C, the majority of the West Bank under its exclusive control. Every year, Israel demolishes hundreds of Palestinian homes, schools, businesses for lacking a nearly impossible to get permit. This policy forces Palestinians out of their homes, and it amounts to forcible transfer, an inhumane act identified under the legal instruments. The fourth inhumane act we document are policies that have stripped Palestinians of their right to legally reside in their homes in the occupied Palestinian territory. So, since 1967, the Israeli government has stripped more than 500,000 Palestinians of their right to live in the West Bank. Similar to what I described about Jerusalem with the example of the two Yale students, they've done it in the West Bank for Palestinians who were abroad for too long, weren't there when the occupation began. Again, people who lived there, that's their home, whose right to live there was stripped on these arbitrary, unlawful bases. And fifth and finally, the last inhumane act we documented is the mass suspension of civil rights for the nearly 5 million Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory. What do I mean by this? For the 55 years that the Israeli army has ruled over the occupied Palestinian territory, Palestinians have not had the right to free expression, assembly, and association. Let's make this real. This gathering, if we were having it in Nablus or in Ramallah or in Bethlehem, would be illegal. Because under Israeli military law, any gathering of more than 10 people without a permit from the Israeli army could subject all of us to a 10-year jail sentence just for this convening. So that's not just a policy that affects young Palestinians, it affects them, their fathers, their grandfathers, their grandmothers, their mothers. So imagine 55 years of no civil rights. So let me conclude with a report by saying, when we put this all together, the intent to dominate that I started with, the systematic oppression, the inhumane acts, Human Rights Watch reached the apartheid determination. Now let me be very clear. This is the most stark assessment Human Rights Watch has ever reached on the conduct of Israeli authorities. It's not the only time we found crimes against humanity in the world. We found that the treatment, for example, of the Rohingya in Myanmar amounted to apartheid persecution. We found crimes against humanity in other places. As was noted in my introduction, I documented crimes against humanity committed by the Egyptian government post-military coup in 2013 when they killed hundreds of protesters after the military coup. So our recommendations in the report are consistent with where we've reached these grave findings in other situations. I won't go in great depth other than to say we call for things like investigating and prosecuting those that are implicated in these crimes, including at the International Criminal Court. We also call for ending all forms of complicity with these crimes. For example, military weapons that are going to Israel that help perpetuate these crimes, those should stop so long as the repression continues. There are many, many other recommendations for businesses. Happy to discuss more. So let me sort of wind towards concluding, because I promised we'd have a lot of time for discussions, by sort of taking a step back and sort of getting down to where I started, right? Which is why we did this research in the conversation, here in the United States in academic freedom. So really our recommendations come down to a basic set of propositions, right? A 55-year occupation is not temporary. A more than 30-year, think about that, 30-year peace process alone is not enough to dismantle systematic repression, right? Denying millions of people their fundamental rights solely because they're Palestinian and not Jewish is not simply a matter of abusive occupation. Democracy is many things. But as my friend Hagai Al-Ad, the director of B'Tselem, the Israeli Human Rights Group, says, democracy is the rule of the people, not the rule of one people over another. A context, a daily reality of structural violence and repression is not a conflict between two equal sides. A single system, methodically engineered to ensure one people flourish and one people do not, is not simply a matter of a conflict between two equal sides. The first step to solving any problem is to diagnose it correctly. Whether that's a doctor treating you at their office, or it's us trying to understand how to deal with a protracted situation of conflict. The wrong diagnosis leads to the wrong remedy, the wrong set of steps. Apartheid is not some hypothetical future scenario. You might not know that in 1974, Yitzhak Rabin, the former Prime Minister of Israel, warned about apartheid. In 2006, former President Jimmy Carter wrote a book, Palestine, Peace Not Apartheid. In 2014, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry warned that we were a year or two away from apartheid. The threshold has been crossed. Palestinians have for years, for decades, been describing their lived reality as one of apartheid, but not enough of us listened. Apartheid is the daily reality for millions of Palestinians. By the way, this isn't simply the conclusion of Human Rights Watch. As Leila noted in her introduction, Amnesty International also concluded that it was apartheid. So has the major human rights groups in Palestinian civil society, dozens of organizations. So has prominent Israeli human rights groups, including the flagship organization B'Tselem. Last month, on the first day the new Israeli government came to power, 27 Israeli human rights groups described apartheid, used the word apartheid to describe Israel's treatment of Palestinians. Israeli human rights organizations. And by the way, it's not just these NGOs. Harvard Law School's International Human Rights Clinic wrote a report last year saying it's apartheid. So did the UN expert in charge of the occupied Palestinian territory. So did the UN expert on discrimination and racism, many other UN experts. Even beyond the human rights movement, you now have a situation where you have prominent voices, right, from figures in pop culture in the United States to professors like Lawrence Tribe, at Harvard, Philippe Sands in the UK, the former, as Leila mentioned, the former Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General. You have former Israeli officials, including the two former Israeli ambassadors to South Africa, the former Director General of Israel's Foreign Ministry, the former Attorney and Deputy Attorney General of Israel, all of whom have now said what we're doing to Palestinians is apartheid. And it's not just them. We now have entire governments. South Africa, which experienced apartheid, knows a thing or two about apartheid, has said the treatment of Palestinians is apartheid. So has Namibia that experienced that. So has last year in the Human Rights Council in Geneva, the entire African bloc of countries, the entire Arab bloc, and the entire Organization of Islamic Conferences all use the term apartheid to describe Israel's treatment of Palestinians. The reality is there is a burgeoning consensus around apartheid. But yet, here we are at Yale. And maybe what I'm saying to you is new, or it's challenging your assumptions, and I hope you'll ask me questions if that's the case. And that brings me to the topic that I'll really sort of conclude on, which is academic freedom. And I'll just say a few words and we can discuss more. Some of you may be aware, it was widely covered in the news, that Kenneth Roth, again, my former boss, who was one of my editors of the report that was published in April 2021, ran Human Rights Watch, one of the world's largest human rights organizations, for nearly 30 years. He stepped down last year, and the Harvard Carr Center for Human Rights at Harvard Kennedy School offered him a fellowship. Makes sense, he ran Human Rights Watch. You're probably qualified to have a Human Rights Fellowship at the Carr Center. They offered him a fellowship. He accepted the fellowship. He was getting ready to start at Harvard in the fall. He had a perfunctory meeting with the dean. The dean, technically, of the Harvard Kennedy School, technically has, the right to veto an appointment. They had a 30-minute chat. During that chat, the dean of the Harvard Kennedy School asked Ken Roth, "Do you have any enemies?" Ken said, "I ran Human Rights Watch. I have a lot of enemies. Let me name them for you. China and Russia have banned me personally from entering the country. Saudi Arabia hates me. Rwanda, the Rwandan government hates me. The Israeli government hates me too." By the way, parenthetically, as a side note, I've also been deported from 4 countries. So Israel's not alone in treating it this way. Syria blocked my entry, Egypt kicked me out, Bahrain kicked me out. Again, if you want stories, save those for Q&A. The point of the story is if you work on human rights, you're not going to be the most beloved person. The dean vetoed Ken's fellowship at Harvard. And this only came in the media last month. It was reported in The Nation magazine by Michael Massing. There suddenly was a large outcry because apparently what the dean told professors at Harvard is that Human Rights Watch has an anti-Israel bias. Now, professors at Harvard maybe aren't like professors at Yale, but they know a thing or two. So they presented research to the dean about ways in which Human Rights Watch's reporting is entirely consistent with the reporting of not only Amnesty International, but actually the very conclusions of the US State Department when it comes to many, many human rights issues. Obviously not the same, but pretty consistent on a lot of metrics. Pressure was built, professors wrote letters, a lot of things happened, and 2 weeks ago, Ken Roth the dean acknowledged the mistake that was made, apologized, and Ken was reauthorized the fellowship, and a week from today, he'll be arriving at Harvard to begin his fellowship at the Carr Center. But what happened to Ken is not exceptional, and it's not unique. There's a report from Palestine Legal, a great NGO, disclosure, I was one of the co-authors before I joined Human Rights Watch when I worked at the Center for Constitutional Rights, called the Palestine exception to the First Amendment. What happened to Ken has been happening to academics who are critical of Israel or speak out on Palestinian rights for years, for decades. And young academics, Palestinians, have faced the worst. Some of you in this audience may have faced it yourself for your activism. But why I'm bringing this all up is things are changing. The threshold has also been crossed on academic freedom. Harvard had to back down because the position of the dean was untenable. He was clearly pressured by somebody. He acknowledged that he made this decision because people who mattered to him wanted him to do this. But that was unsustainable. I'm here talking to you at Yale. There's a full house. I've been doing this in many other campuses. The conversation is shifting. The arc of history is bending. Now this is happening at the very same time that the situation on the ground is getting worse and worse by the day. So we live in this dichotomy. It's really, really bad. In many ways, the pressure on the ground is unprecedented. But at the same time, the conversation is shifting. And where I'll leave you with is our hope in many cases is all of you in the room today that you're going to raise your voice, that you're going to act. So let me just really end with my last sentence by saying, those in this audience who strive for Israeli and Palestinian peace, whatever you believe might be the way forward, the first step to getting there is to recognize the reality for what it is. Let's call a spade, and let's bring to bear the sorts of human rights tools needed to get us to a better future. Thank you.